So I was actually, I was with a group of guys the other night, and we kind of joked about this. Like, who would you actually take? And the strategicness, that's not a word, strategery, also not a word. Strategic thinking around this was so fascinating because you think about guys, or you think about masculinity, you think about manhood. We said this last week, but, there's very much like a specific view, especially in Western culture, of like what a man is or what a man looks like. And we said this last week, so I'm gonna spend a few minutes getting us all caught up, but we said this last week, that every man has already decided what it means to be a man. And most of that is stuff that's been given to them, right? So like somewhere along the way, you decided what a man was, right? And for those of us who are men in the room, right, there was a point in time where you go like, I aspire to be more like this. Many of you had like a hero. Maybe it was like a fictional character. For some of you, it was a dad. For many of you, it was like a grandfather. Right? How many of you knew your grandfather and he was like a man? Do you know what I'm talking about? Anybody? Yeah. I love it. Like we all know what I meant when I said it that way. Like there's something about that where you were given a version of what masculinity looks like, and you sort of like built what manhood sort of was. Now, we said this last week too. We said this, that what we end up doing is we judge others, right? We judge others by the masculinity script that many of us were given internally. And what I mean by that is this, that you look at other men, right? Whether you're a woman or a man, you look at other men, and whatever script of masculinity or manhood looks like, we judge other men by whatever that internal script is. And then you hear this, and this is where it gets so fascinating. And many of you along the way didn't live up to or didn't meet the standards of whatever your view around manhood was. And so what happens is a lot of times, if you weren't man enough, many of you have heard versions of this, you weren't man enough, there are phrases that we say to men or guys or specifically boys when they're not enough when it comes to some of these scripts. We'll say things like this. We'll say, hey, what you gotta do is you just gotta man up. You know what I'm talking about? You just gotta man up. Right, how many of you have ever seen or heard or said that before? How many of you just need to man up? You just need to become more of whatever that is. You got to step it up, suck it up. Real men never, right? Many of you were given scripts early on. Real men never cry. Real men never show emotions like that. Or real men always, right? Real men always, and they have a very clear distinctive of what those things are. You'll hear things like, don't be soft. I'll never forget, somebody told me this one time in my first job that I had in leadership, which was, I was a sophomore in high school. I was leading people that were older than me. And I'll never forget, somebody said something along the lines of like, fake it till you make it. And then they said a version of like, don't ever let them see you sweat. And I'm like, I sweat just breathing. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a little bit of this, like I'm sweating right now. Like I don't know. And I remember thinking like, if that's what masculinity is, like never showing any sort of weakness or insecurity or fear, that is a very particular script that you're given. Now, when we talk about masculinity, this is what we said last week, to give us like a very clear definition around this, we know like what masculinity does is it ends up shaping the identities of our sons, and it ends up shaping our daughters' expectations of what men are, right? And part of this is so important because whatever script we hand down when it comes to masculinity or manhood, it shapes everybody, right? It shapes everybody. It shapes everybody in your family. It's gonna shape your kids. It's gonna shape their kids. It's gonna shape what their counseling sessions look like one day. It's gonna shape all sorts of things. And it's so important that we have a clear script on what this is. And so what we said is this, and this is an oversimplified version of this, when we talk about masculinity in particular, what we're saying is it's a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles that are generally associated with men or with boys, right? Now, I put this in my notes last week, and this is kind of where we're gonna sort of pick up where we're going today. Is last week we talked about what is a Christian ethic or idea of masculinity and manhood look like. And so today what we're doing is we're gonna talk a little bit about what does it look like to have these socially constructed ideas of what masculinity actually is. Put in my notes, I said this, masculinity is in a lot of ways socially constructed, but that does not mean that it's meaningless. It means that we need a very specific and I believe higher source about what it means to be a man, specifically a person who is a Christian man. Now, what we talked about last week, and I remember I showed you this picture in a second, but we said this, like when you talk about Jesus as the standard or the higher source of this, there are really two camps, and neither one is fully accurate, right? There's the camp that's like the warrior, and then there's like sweet and passive, sweet baby Jesus version of Jesus, right? I showed you these two pictures, which is so maddening a little bit, but there's like this version of Jesus with like a gun, and then there's like this version of Jesus with a lamb. Generally, there's kids around, and both of these make us equally uncomfortable in different ways. And both of them are a view of what people have about Jesus, right? And so specifically men, and I think this is so fascinating, men oftentimes don't enjoy church people, or even the idea of Christianity, because the version of Jesus that they were handed was a soft, cuddle-me, Teletubby version of Jesus, right? And then there's some scripts around masculinity and some scripts around Jesus that you know this. He's always angry. He's always like just, and you hear the tone of it, and the tone of it feels like the father or the grandfather or the coach that you had that was very much this, but not at all loving, right? And even, it's almost like and some of you know this, you've heard this voice or this tone. It's the man who says that they love you in a way where it feels like they don't love you at all, you know? There's like a weirdness to this. And this is what we said last week. Jesus was neither one of those, and at the same time, fully both the lion, this is where the images that we got last week, and the lamb. That Jesus embodied both of these things. And when it comes to masculinity, when it comes to manhood, and this is what we talked about, and this is kind of where we ended it, is that Christian men follow who Jesus was and choose to respond and build their life around that script, which is the lion and the lamb. Now, there was a third one that I didn't get to, and I told you this last week. I was like, I really wanted to do this series of talks. I was originally gonna do it in one sermon, and I just assumed you didn't wanna sit for 3.5 hours and listen to me teach on it. So we decided to break it up over 3 weeks. But the third piece of this is actually where we're gonna spend sort of the bulk of our time talking today. And it picks up from where we left off here. So we said that Christian men, right, embody, or they like build their life around this idea of strength with a lion and also love, care, and support of a lamb. And then we said that ultimately men cultivate the strength, power, and courage and yield it for the benefit of other people. Now, I gave you a caveat last week and I said this. Some of you are sitting in the room and you go, wait, does this not apply to women? And I would say that's not true, right? There are also women who embody these sorts of things. I am not just saying this is only for men. I'm just talking to the men, right? And so when it comes to this, I think the sort of foundational approach and idea around this is that men do, from a Christian perspective, embody what it means to follow Jesus in these specific ways. And there are oftentimes that women have these sorts of things too, and certainly everyone is living their life to benefit others. But for the next few weeks, what we're doing is we're talking specifically to men in this way. Now, I'm gonna tell you what we're gonna do today, and if you're a person who goes, man, I love for you to unpack 35 verses and do that for the next few minutes, I'm not gonna do that. We're gonna spend time in 5 verses in particular and unpack this. I'll also say this, if you're a follower of Jesus, the passage that we're gonna look at, you have heard and probably seen, and you've probably read a lot. If you're not a follower of Jesus, I think you're probably gonna enjoy the context around this. But we're gonna look in terms of like these few verses and one primary word that lends itself to I think what it means to sort of complete the picture of who Jesus was when it comes to Jesus as a man in particular. So we're looking at an area of the Bible called John. John is one of Jesus' close followers. And you look at all the writings of the beginning parts of the New Testament, right? You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These are eyewitness accounts of what happened with Jesus' life. But what John does is he's writing to a very specific audience, and his writings to this specific audience had a slightly different purpose than the other guys, right? And his writings here is to a group of people who had a very specific philosophical context, which they built everything. So he begins his writing on this with the idea and some of the language that they use, which makes it very, I think, poignant for us and where we are now. So here's the verse we're gonna kick off in John chapter 1, verse 1. Here's what it says. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, this is fascinating. The language around this is interesting. If you read it for the first time, it feels kind of like, I remember being a kid reading this, and I was like, we're talking about the Bible. We're not talking about the Bible. What John is referencing is actually Jesus when he says the Word. But the original language here is actually what makes this passage so interesting, because the original language is a word that you have seen, certainly the root of, but in the context that he's writing it in, it has like really deep and rich thoughts around it. But here's what he actually says in the original language. He says this. He would say, in the beginning, and we'll go to the next one, was the Logos, right? And the Logos was with God, and Logos was God. And so here's kind of the like interesting sort of thoughts around this that he's sort of building out. Is that in the context, this idea of Logos was built out in the culture in which he's writing to, which it was sort of the primary thread, the moral authority that lends itself through really most of the philosophical teaching, specifically of the Roman world. And so when he's writing this, here's what's so fascinating. He's writing to a group of people in particular who would have viewed this logos as something to pursue, understand, and fully adopt. In fact, a lot of the, your 7th grade to 9th grade social studies, there's probably teaching around some of these thoughts. You would have read Socrates, you would have read some Plato, you'd have read some of these things. And at the core of many of their teachings was this idea that you are embracing to some way, understanding a core thought that would move its way through all of humanity. And here's the difference, and here's what John is writing towards. But that was sort of like almost like a stagnant, non-moving, certainly impersonal logos that existed in the world that wasn't connected to a person. And what John out the gate sort of writes here and repackages around all of this, he says the logos isn't sort of this stagnant, disconnected thing. The logos is actually deeply connected to a person, and that person being Jesus. All right, so we go to the next slide there again. So when he's writing this, he goes on, and a few verses later, he says it. He says it this way. He says, so the Logos, again, the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So he's tying it specifically to Jesus, made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father. And then he says this. He says, full of grace and full of truth. Now, again, reading it 2025, especially if you've been a follower of Jesus for quite a while, you've heard phrases like full of grace and truth. Like, that's not new to you. The Logos thing probably isn't new to you. Jesus being God is certainly not new to you. But the framework by which John is writing and the context that he's writing in becomes so incredibly important, and here's why. Because there is an assumption in the culture that he is writing to, that there is sort of a primary moral, there is sort of a primary sense of like engaging with this logos. But he is saying very specifically that the embodiment, right? We'll go to the next one. The embodiment of the logos is a person. More plainly put, I'll say it this way. He writes to this whole context and group of people saying this. You are searching for an impersonal moral authority, but it's not an impersonal moral authority. The God of the universe embodies the thing that you're looking for. And what you are actually pursuing with your life is not found in something that is disconnected or disengaged with you. It's found in a person, and that person is Jesus. Right? Now, the way this connects to us is this. Most people that I meet who are relatively thoughtful, right, have the exact same longing desire that they would have had. And the question isn't like, why do we have life? That's not the question. The question isn't like even what do we do with it? The question, for many of us is like where is the authority of what is good and what is not? Like, where do I actually position and anchor myself? And for John, he's going like, it's the embodiment of Jesus, the Christ. And then he goes on, he says this in verse 2. It says, so he was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And then he goes on and he makes the statement that we're going to sort of camp on for the next few minutes. Here's what he says. He says, and in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Now, here's how this connects, I think, specifically to what we're talking about today. The way that John describes Jesus, and again, I know I take a deep dive on it. The way that John describes Jesus is that he's the embodiment of the Logos, and don't miss this, but also the light to all that is true. That he is actually the one who shows up in the darkness and in the confusion and in the parts of our lives where we look at it and we go, like, I don't know how to make sense of all this, or what is truth, or where do I anchor my life? What John says is like, look, with authority, Jesus is the light in all of that darkness. And I'll tell you, as I thought through some of this, I would say this. I've experienced several versions of this in my own life. Most men that I have talked to have experienced versions of this as well. But how many of you either know or have walked through, you don't have to answer this out loud, maybe you ever known or seen somebody who has walked through sort of like an existential version of just being a little bit lost? It's so interesting to me. Most men that I talk to, whether they're 17 or 28, 49, 73, have seasons of their life where one of the big questions is, what do I do now and where am I? There's a disorientation over and over again that most men tend to feel along the way. It goes, what am I doing here? And they feel lost, right? Now, one of these ways that people feel lost, and you see this with men all the time, is like a relational sort of lostness, right? Right? This relational sort of lostness that causes men oftentimes to like feel disoriented in their relationships, right? If you're married, you know this, like there are times with your husband, you've probably seen this, where it's like he's there, but he's not really there. You know what I'm talking about? Like there are seasons of life where you look at them and it's like he's a little bit of a ghost. Like he's around and he's present-ish, but his mind is somewhere else because he's just sort of disconnected and disengaged, right? There's this part of this relational drift that, and this happens to most men over and over and over again throughout their lives, where betrayal sends them into a place where they don't trust, and then they don't trust, and then what they do is they continue to build very fortified walls around their mind, heart, and vulnerability that cause them to just experience a lostness in their life. The other one is this, midlife drift, right? Midlife drift, this is always a fascinating one. Now, I don't know when this hits. I'm 37, and I experienced this around 35. So you know what I mean? Now, I imagine I'm going to experience this several other times, but there's a point where you go, I'm at a point in my life where I look around, and I just feel a little bit burned out, a little bit tired, a little bit disoriented. And there's like this, how do I say this well? It's like a quiet collapse of your identity and your anchoring in who you were made to be. And this can happen at 20. This can happen at 15. This will likely happen to you in some middle version of wherever your life is, where you look around and you just go, like, I thought I knew who I was, and now I just don't know that I know. And you still show up to work, and you still do a good job, and you still work hard, but you go to these things, and somewhere in the back of your mind, somewhere in the back of your heart is like this sort of questioning of like, is this all that there is? Am I actually doing something with my life? Does this matter? You sit with your kids and you notice, you look at every other dad, right? And you go, man, they're great. Like I make a baseball reference every Sunday because, you know, I do. And so I was coaching the other night. I watched the dad coaching the other night. I watched him, and the way that this sounds so funny, the way that he ended his team meeting, it was the other team. It was so stalkerish of me. I am like standing in the back. I'm cleaning up. I was done real fast. But I was standing there talking to the other guy, and he casted vision for these 8 and 9-year-olds. And I'm like, I get paid to do that. You know what I mean? Like he's just like killing it. And I'm standing there going, wow. And he is. He's a phenomenal dad. And immediately my brain goes to, am I enough? Which is sort of the core question around this. Am I enough? Am I doing enough? Am I enough? And I'm watching it. I actually texted him later that night. I was like, man, it was so good. And you know, the text is from 2 different places. Admiration and insecurity. And you know, men who walk through this, you go, I just feel a little bit lost. The other one is this, and you experience this too, appetites and insecurity. That you have appetites that are never fully and finally satisfied. And because they're not fully and finally satisfied, they give you just enough pleasure to numb away your own insecurities and pain. Men who feel betrayal, men who feel like they're struggling, men who feel like they're not enough, men who don't have a core identity that's like anchored in something. Like eventually the appetites numb them enough to not feel them for the 17 to 47 seconds. And then they move on to the next thing. And this is just really honest and blunt. You go like, at some point, those appetites and satisfying those appetites in these microwaves just sort of build. And you look around and you find men whose lives implode. And it's not because of one sort of set of decisions at the end of it. It's because of 1,000 micro numbing moments where they just didn't want to feel pain and insecurity anymore. And you look back and you go, and here's this is the really honest part. What you feel is shame. And the shame just builds. And men who just have this deep-rooted shame, it just builds it just spirals into more insecurity. And what a lot of people will tell you, and this is where it's a little bit maddening for me, you know, because again, because of what I do, I listen to pastors all the time. And a lot of times what you hear is we'll just stop doing it. And then every guy just goes, well, now I just feel more shameful because I feel like every other guy just stopped doing whatever that thing is where my appetite. And then at the end of it, you're either fully or sort of minimally addicted to something that is wildly unhelpful to your heart. And it causes you to spiral more and more and more. Now, the last one I'm going to tell you is one that I think happens to a lot of men. And as it happens, it is actually one of the more dangerous out of anything else we're going to talk about. And that's this. Men who experience a form of success often experience all of these things to a higher degree. And again, this can happen to you at 21. This can happen to you at 46. This can happen to you at 83. And here's what this looks like, and you know it. You experience a form of success that you thought would make you feel enough or more like a man with the scripts that you were given. And then you got it. And you looked around and you go, what else? And then you got to the next one and you looked around and you go, what else? And it's not that any of it's bad. In fact, all of it's good. You did well, and everybody around you is doing this. And you smile, but in the back of your mind, what you feel in the midst of all the success is a level of emptiness that you can't fully explain. And there's a pain that just doesn't let up, because what you look at is going, success was the thing that I wanted. And many of you, what you did is your dad wasn't as successful as you thought he should be. And so you were manning up and you were like, you know what, I'm gonna be more than they were. And here's what's weird, and this is where it gets really trippy in your head. And then the men that you admired saw your success, and they all came around you and they're like, you did great. And you looked around and you go, but what now? You both felt affirmed like you wanted to, and on the other side of it, you went, this isn't enough for me. And I'll tell you, we can just stop here and pray. I feel like great ways to end it. Most of us have felt, will feel, or in the midst of feeling that thing, whatever those things are, and many of us, a couple at one time. And I'm very tempted to try to give you like 9 steps out of that. And the real reality of this that's painful and difficult, and I'm just be honest, there is not more for you to do in any of those circumstances. There's just not more for you to do. There's not a level of success that will fully and finally satisfy. There's not an appetite that you satisfy that puts a period rather than ellipses, right? The insecurity that you have felt as long as you were turning inward will never be fully and finally done. The midlife stuff that pops up happens. It happens, right? There is not a way for you to be fully and finally satisfied in these things with more for you to do. And so at the core of this is actually a full posture change in your outlook. Now I'm going to say one caveat, and then we're going to look at the rest of the verse, and then we're going to wrap up in a second. What I'm talking about today is significantly harder for those of you who are followers of Jesus and have been followers of Jesus for a long time, because you've also been successful at being a follower of Jesus. You checked every box, you read the Bible, you're here, good job. You did all the Christian things. And it's not just about those things. And so what John writes, and again, why this is so important, is in verse 4, I'm going to read it again, and we're going to look at verse 5. That's where we're going to wrap up in the text. Here's what it says. It says, in him, being Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And the next verse is, I think, where the clarity comes. He says this. He says, so the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, you hear this preached all the time, like you go out in the world and, empowered by Jesus, you shine a light and you bring goodness to the world, and the goodness is better than the badness, and so that gets better. And that's true. I do believe that's true. But what's also true is that full submission and open-handedness to Jesus also does this to the internal parts of your heart and soul more than anything else that you could ever work to achieve could do, right? I put in my notes this way, that Jesus, the light, right, shines in, should have put a apostrophe there, or an I, either one of those would have been great. It's like South Carolina educated. That's right, man, come on, let's go. Shines in the darkness. And can I say this? The imagery that John gives is understood to be a light that is held in front of you for the path that you were called to walk in. And that light is him. Which means that all of the other to-do stuff that you're going to do is fine. But that's not, it is realigning your mind and your heart and vision to say, I am going to obey, and I'm going to follow, and I'm going to trust you. You were given a script somewhere along the way about masculinity looks like. But what Jesus embodied is a script that is so clear and empowered by him is when it becomes possible for you. Here's what that script looks like, right? Script is forgiveness without being asked. It is returning good for evil when it's given to you. It's a person who sees lust as dehumanizing to the people that are the focus of whatever the lust is. It leaves revenge to God. You're like, man, does God get revenge? David seemed to think so. That's not yours to get. That's not yours to get in any area of your life. It leaves revenge to God. It celebrates other men's successes, but like means it. I should have put that, but like means it, you know? Is not owned by his stuff. It sees possessions as tools, not trophies. It elevates others instead of himself. It weeps at loss without shame. Now, can I just pause for a second? For those of you men in the room, you read through this, and you go, this feels like a to-do list. And I'm just going to tell you, this is not the to-do list. This is the fruit that comes out of being obedient to who Jesus is. Now go on, because I like lists today. It helps those who can never repay them and predetermines that they're going to be helpers to those who can never repay. It controls himself, not others, and I'll miss this, is not mastered by appetites or emotions. Knows when to flip tables and when to turn cheeks, right? Speaks truth no matter what the cost. Fights for others' rights, not just his own. Stays steady in trouble, not shaken by it. I wish I could convince everybody on this one. Ends each day with a clear conscience, which means that you lean into the awkward texts that you should send and the calls that you should make, right? Fights daily against the appetites and insecurities and measures success. And I'll miss this. I wish I could convince every man of this. Measures success by doing what God's will is for their life. I'm going to tell you, you read this, I read this, and you go, I don't measure up to that. And I'm just going to tell you, Jesus modeled this. And today is a specific day in Christianity that gets so celebrated, the day of Pentecost. Meaning this, Jesus lived this way, calls us to live this way, and then gave us the power of the Holy Spirit to be empowered to live out what he's called us to live through our submission and our focused direction on who he's called us to be. And if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, let me just say this. Can I just say, you look at a list like this, my gut says you don't disagree with very many of these things that most of us believe, that all men should embody these kinds of things. And Jesus modeled this. And then Jesus called men to it. And then on the other side of it, he goes, I am empowering you to live this way through the power of the Holy Spirit, your open-handedness, and your submission, your predetermined submission to follow me, right? I put in my notes, I said it this way. When you embrace this Jesus script in particular, you bring the fight to the two enemies specifically of your heart, which is your appetites and your insecurities, right? Now, this we're going to wrap up, and we're going to pick back up next week. But I would say this. For those of you in the room who are not followers of Jesus, and you look at this and you go, I believe that part of my journey is trying to do better. I think that is a noble pursuit. I just don't think it ends in the place where you want it to end. And here's how I know that, right? That if in your own strength and in your own power you could, you would have, or, and I wish I could convince everybody of this, or just set a date on the calendar that's your goal to get to that place where this becomes sort of more natural in your response. And if you get to that date and you don't get there, I would say this, great. I would love for you to turn back to what we're talking about here and do three things. The three things are this. Acknowledge, I'm actually not enough, which is true. True of all people. You in and of yourself are not enough to move to where God's calling you to be. Second is this, acknowledge this, I need Jesus. And the last one is this, and Paul talks about this significantly throughout the New Testament. He says, you embrace your own weakness and realize, and this is the upside down part of the gospel, is that in your weakness, his strength is made most apparent to you and through you. And when you do that, I'm just going to tell you, I really believe this. Your life begins to change. And it doesn't change a little bit. Your life changes when you predetermine that you are going to follow the person of Jesus. Now, I'll say two things, and I'm going to pray. When you hear this kind of stuff, and I know this, everybody's got some version of a pushback to masculinity, toxic masculinity, Rambo-ness, I don't know, whatever this kind of stuff is, and especially in our culture, I just kind of laugh, going like, it feels like it just all sort of, anytime you say masculinity, it just feels like it doesn't fit. But I'll say this. Christian masculinity is described in the New Testament. What Jesus embodied and modeled for us, I so deeply believe, is the way that men should be in the world. And there is not a one-to-one formula around what it looks like for you with your personality compared to every other man, right? There are cultural pieces of this that are just cultural, right? There are pieces of this that are just cultural pieces of this. But at the core of who you are as a man is to say, I am choosing to follow Jesus. And so I'm pretty sure I ripped this from Andy Stanley, right? Yeah, he's a pastor in Atlanta. He says it this way, and I love the way that he said it, but he said this. He says, following Jesus, right, doesn't make all men the same, but following Jesus does make all men better. It doesn't mean that you're going to be the same way that your dad was or that your grandfather was. It doesn't mean that you embrace every script that involves you fishing and shooting things, right? It could. That's kind of fun, but it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that all men look the same, but it means that all men become better when they follow the person and the way of Jesus. So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. And you're like, last week we talked about like the lion, the lamb thing. This week we're talking about Jesus as the light of all of this. I wanted to end with like this rousing and here we go, charge the hill, Braveheart, kind of whatever thing. But I would much rather you take a week and actually feel the weight of what we talked about in the middle of the sermon, which is the midlife thing, the appetites and insecurity thing, the parts of the script in your life where you go like, I just feel the sort of deep tension around that. And if you're a follower of Jesus for 1 week, I'd love for you to go, I want you, Jesus, to shine light on these areas and show me what I should do and where I should go. And then I want you to write it down. Like everybody teases me. I'm a journaler. I know I'm a journaler. Not everybody's a journaler. But if you're not, you can become a journaler for 7 days for 3 minutes. Anybody can do it. Pull out your Apple Notes app, and if you use an Android, I'm so sorry. I'm just kidding. But like pull out your Android Apple Notes app, do that sort of thing. And I would just say this. Whatever that is, write it down. And just say this. And you could be wrong. I think that's totally fine. You go, here's what I feel like God is speaking to me about this thing. And write it down about one of those sorts of things. And then next week, what we're going to do is we're going to come back. And whatever I got to do to convince you to come back next week, I wish I could convince you. Like whatever I've got to do to come back next week, I will buy your lunch. That's not true. I can't buy lunch for everybody. But I would love for you to come. We'll do whatever it takes. Don't miss next week. What we're going to do is we're going to pick up and we're talking about what this actually looks like practically in our lives next week. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this truth. Thank you that we get the words of John so specifically written to a group of people, and at the same time, so specific to many of us who live in the culture that we live in now. We spend a lot of time sort of unpacking and poking at what I believe many men in this room, many men that are going to watch online, feel consistently. We're not always sure what to do with. So, Father, many of us have tried so many different things, and we continue to work, and we continue to strive, and we continue just to do better. But God, I ask that maybe that you would help us for at least 1 week to just pause and stop that part of it and ask ourselves, what are you speaking to us about us? Give us the courage to write down what we feel like you're saying, even if we feel like we might be wrong. God, give us the courage to look at that and engage with whatever those thoughts are. And I ask that you would help those of us who are followers of you to be open-handed about what you're saying and respond. And I pray for the person in the room who is not a follower of you, but is willing to try it for a week. God, I ask that you show up in such a tangible way where it feels undeniable that you are speaking to them. And God, that you would help them to wrestle through some of the things that we're talking about with you as they do that. We love you and thank you. In Jesus' name we pray.